Welcome into another episode of Eyes on Golf. We're going to bring in John Nucci to talk all about, I guess you could say, the legal implications of everything going on the PGA Tour. So if you want this all explained, what is going on with the PGA Tour and LIV Golf, we're going to get to that in just a brief moment. But I want to bring in my producer here, Sam Brief, making his first appearance here on the third episode. We're going to try to start a lot of these podcasts with Sam asking questions for the people, I should say. But also, what are we calling this segment, Sam?
Briefly speaking, because just like you introduced me with a brief pun, my whole life has been brief puns. So this is briefly speaking.
Sam is also, for everyone out there, an awesome broadcaster. Just finished up an illustrious career with the Chicago Dogs, a minor league baseball team out there in Chicago. You were. What was the award that you won, Sam?
It was American Association Broadcaster of the Year. Now, my mother probably wouldn't like me bragging about that, but you asked, so I'll tell.
I just want the Broadcaster of the Year. That's the important part. And Sam's going to do some awesome work this year for NBC Olympics in the lead up to Paris, but he's also with us. So I'll give you the floor right now. Obviously, I'll be here. Sam, you have some questions for me that hopefully I can map out for the people.
Yeah, first off, thanks for the kind intro. Obviously, I'm fired up to be part of the Eyes on Golf team. We're going to build this into something special. But before we talk to John, who's a bona fide expert in all things golf law, sports law, and we'll dive into it, I just want to get some of the fundamentals out of the way because I've followed this pretty closely. And I know that a few months ago, the PGA Tour and LIV Golf announced a merger. And that hasn't happened. So why?
Yes, and we will get everything. John's going to get into a lot of things even more than me, but to kind of give people a prologue here, what was signed on June 6th was a framework agreement between the PGA Tour and the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia. That basically mapped out the bones of what a merger would look like, but it's not an officially confirmed merger. So there have been multiple deadlines that have been changed, pushed back. Right now, December 31st is the deadline that is marked up that these two sides need to hammer out some sort of agreement. Not everything ends after that date. They'll probably, if they don't reach something, there'll be an extension. There's a lot of nitty-gritty stuff. But the bottom line is the framework was announced, but the two entities, and when I specifically say Public Investment Fund because that is the parent company to LIV Golf, they still continue to operate their independent entities in golf, which is not just LIV Golf, but you can go to the Aramco Team Series on the Ladies European Tour side. You can go to Saudi Golf or Golf Saudi as a whole. And then the PGA Tour and DP World Tour continue to operate their verticals. So that is why the merger hasn't officially happened, even though the framework agreement was signed.
So essentially, it was not the headline that I read, which was PGA Tour and LIV Golf merge. It's LIV Golf and PGA Tour announce intention to merge, and we have to see what's going to happen in the next few months.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. I think there were also some things we should note, some things that changed kind of in that moment. There was an agreement at the time, a non-poaching clause that neither side could poach each other's golfers. That was taken out about a month later because what also has to happen is this all has to pass through the Department of Justice in the United States. And because of anti-competitive behavior, that clause could not exist for them to get all this passed. So there's, again, John's going to get into this from a legal side, but that is basically the baseline of what you need to know there.
So I know when John comes on, we're going to get really deep into the weeds because that's why we have him. He studies sports law.
He's smarter than us.
He's way smarter, and hence he's the guest on our podcast. I just want to get your thoughts on this big picture question that's been bumbling around my mind a lot. How do you think golf is going to change in the next 5 years, 10 years? If you want to go even further, feel free to.
No, I think that, you started to see it with the PGA Tour and the signature events this past year, that the objective here for all of golf, and you could throw out the tours, is to get the best players in the same place more often than they had been. Because really it had been the majors and the Players' Championship, and then you could say that the FedEx Cup playoffs had added a little bit to this. There were certain events, the Memorial, the Arnold Palmer Invitational come to mind, but really what you're going to continue to see now is a centralized version of that. Now, a sport like NASCAR and Formula One, you think about, they're racing in a different location every week, and the same guys are going every week. Golf, because of the 4-day grind, and because every event ends up really being a week if you play in it, because you have to practice and get there early, it's not going to be every week. But I do think that we'll continue to see more centralized players, and I think that we will also see a more diverse area where more diverse locations where golf is played. I do think the game will get more international. I don't think it's going to go to the level of tennis where you're on a different continent, it feels like, every week, and there's a different swing on every continent. I think the US will still be the base of competitive golf, but I do think we're going to see more in Europe, more in Australia, more in South America, more, I don't want to leave anyone out, more, we'll see South Africa, we'll see the Middle East, we'll see a lot more golf spread around the world.
Well, and as space exploration continues to blossom and flourish, maybe we'll even see Mars, Venus, Jupiter, or Saturn.
You never know.
Jeff,
I'm not
one more
counting
thing.
anything out.
I mean, hey, you got Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos spending billions to go out to space. We'll see what happens. One more thing I want to get out of the way before we bring John on is there's been so much, of course, in the last couple of weeks about John Rahm. We had an emergency podcast last week. He's going to LIV Golf.
Yep.
What do you think has changed, or has it at all changed since he made that announcement?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And, you saw the immediate reaction on the PGA Tourist side. Strategic Sports Group was the announcement. I want to make sure I get that right. I believe that was the group of these, Strategic Sports Group, the group of these professional sports owners in North America who have come together, led by Fenway Sports Group, to be an investor, potentially to be a partner in this new PGA Tour for-profit company, which is kind of working title PGA Tour Enterprises. We'll see what it is exactly called. And that is a reaction a little bit to what I talked about the DOJ, because the original merger announcement that you talked about in June said that the Public Investment Fund would be the top investor in this new for-profit company. Now, there's some murkiness within the Department of Justice if they would approve that. So there's potentially going to be another private equity partner. Strategic Sports Group has emerged as that group. John Henry, Mark Lazary, your boy, Tom Ricketts, Sam, there's a lot of big names in there. They could potentially end up being I don't want to call it a majority partner, but maybe the plurality, or whatever John will tell us the right legal term is for that, because I don't know if anyone's going to own 50%, but you might need an investor based in the United States to lead this group. So I think that's a little bit of the reaction. We'll see. It's a bit of an expedited reaction to Jon Rahm being one of those top 3 players on the PGA Tour that goes to LIV Golf. And all of this is to try to get something done by December 31st, or at least move in the right direction, that if that extension comes, it does not go. If this affects the 2024 season, no one wants it to affect the 2025 season, in terms of still the objective of getting the best players to all play together.
And also for fans who are looking to keep comprehending some of these giant salaries that guys are getting from LIV Golf, Jon Rahm's has been reported as high as $600 million. Our guest, John Nucci, tweeted this last week that is 0.086% of the PIF's assets. So that's the equivalent of one of us buying a cup of coffee. Although cost of inflation here in Chicago and you in New York, I'd say not even that. So it just scratches the surface of what the PIF is able to do.
With that said, I also saw a tweet that mentioned that Tommy DeVito is now more famous than Jon Rahm after what he did the last couple of weeks. So we'll talk about maybe the brand equity and value needs to be put in separate terms, in terms of what Jon Rahm is making. Obviously, significantly more a year than Shohei Ohtani is making, and that would have been even before he deferred $68 million per year.
Yeah, Shohei's making like $2 million a year. Come on, that's child's play. Well,
bottom line,
I was on a walk right before we did this recording here, and I found this dirty golf ball on my street corner.
Is that a Max Fly?
It is a Marathon.
Okay,
can barely
sure.
read it. I don't live anywhere near a golf course or a driving range. I have no idea why this was on the corner of my street in downtown Chicago, but it tells me it's a perfect day to record our podcast.
And that, folks, is the first ever Briefly Speaking. Sam, appreciate that. Hopefully we gave you some context and a prologue as we get into John Nucci right now, who I call golf's #1 internet lawyer. We're about to talk to him and find out everything from the legal side of what is going on right now between the PGA Tour and LIV Golf. This is Eyes on Golf. I'm glad to now be with John Nucci, who I will call basically at this point Twitter's favorite golf lawyer. And John, on top of that, you are an attorney as well. You are the chief golf law correspondent at Conduct Detrimental. I also want to mention you're, I believe, an adjunct professor at Nazareth University, the alumni of Jeff Van Gundy. I don't know if there's anyone more famous than Jeff Van Gundy to go there.
Yes, he is an alumni. Both Jeff and Stan Van Gundy, both Rochester natives. Yeah.
Oh, both. That's a fair point there. But let's talk about golf. All right. I mentioned you being, like I said, I've become such a big fan following all your work, I can't imagine when you decided to go to law school, you went to Penn State, that you imagined that you'd be going through all of this anti-competitive behavior and all of the legal proceedings featuring the PGA Tour and LIV Golf. Before we get into all of that, I do want to know from you, how did you get into this? How did golf law become such a big part of your life?
Yeah, it's a good question because I kind of fell into it. I actually went into law school thinking I was going to do criminal law. That was my initial foray into that, and then I did that for about 3 hours and was like, yeah, this is not for me. So I started transitioning to other things that I love, which is sports, and kind of went all in on a career and wanted to work, in sports law. And I just so happened to be a big golf fan. On top of that, I actually, my initial golf background came mostly from golf betting. I have a group of friends that we pretty religiously study and listen to dozens of podcasts every week, try to pick value picks every week. We've actually done pretty well, but it was mostly in golf betting, and I just became a really big golf fan, and I play the game a lot. And then once the PGA Tour and LIV litigation happened, I just kind of realized that there were a ton of journalists on Twitter that were trying to decipher the legal aspects of
didn't know anything.
Yeah, there are a lot of people that were trying to decipher all of the legal jargon and court filings that were going back and forth. And it's kind of seemed like people might need some help. So I saw a little bit of a niche there, and I tried to kind of fill it. And I think it's gone pretty well so far. It's exceeded my expectations for sure.
We should. I try to say on these podcasts, obviously, I'm an independent contractor to the PGA Tour. I broadcast for PGA Tour Live. So it's, it is hard in ways for me to come off as totally unbiased. And I tell people if they want to turn off the podcast right away, go ahead. But that's why I have people like you on to talk about this. So for me, 2022, things start. I know there were some rumblings of, wasn't even called LIV Golf at first. Greg Norman was going to be the CEO of all this. And then there was everything that happened with Phil around the Genesis Invitational that year. And still at that point, I wasn't sure if I saw things coming. When did you see things earlier, maybe as a lawyer? Did anyone see what was about to come from that side? Again, I'm speaking specifically from the legal side of what was happening between the PGA Tour and LIV Golf, the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia. Were there any precedents to what was about to go on?
Certainly no precedent in the context of this has never happened before. I think there were maybe some hints at we were headed toward litigation when, we were getting emails that started off with things like "surely you jest," stuff like that Greg Norman was firing off. Some statements like that are just inherently threatening. But when the players started, the LIV players started talking about focusing on the fact that they feel that they're independent contractors, which they are, that they can play anywhere, that they should be able to play on both tours, and kind of the timing of it leading up to when LIV London started and the players got suspended, and then the FedEx Cup happening just a couple months after that. I kind of expected at that point them to try to file, for a restraining order that allowed them to play, and then maybe add on to that after that. I also, when we found out that it was a condition of at least some LIV players' contracts that they were supposed to recruit PGA Tour members, that also I tweeted out even before the PGA Tour filed their tortious interference lawsuit against LIV, that kind of opens them up to a tortious interference claim, because if they are obligated to try to go get people to break their membership with the tour, then that kind of opens it up. So there were some rumblings here and there, but there's been so many developments that have been unexpected lately. I certainly can't pretend to have predicted all of it. That's for sure.
Well, to put into context some of what you just said. The first LIV event you mentioned, LIV London, I believe it was right before the U.S. Open, or right. I believe right before the U.S. Open in 2022 was LIV London. So we're talking right around late spring. That's when some of the contractual language perhaps started to leak, and then that's been continued to leak and leak and leak, and this entire process has leaked for the last year and a half or so. You fast forward everything to the point of June 6th, which we touched on a little bit in the intro before you came on. That's D-Day. The date that we all woke up. I'm sitting in my living room. That's right. I'm sitting in my living room. To my left, I know where I was sitting watching the CNBC interview, that we saw Jay Monahan and Yasser Al-Rumayyan on TV talking about things and using the term merger. Now you see it on every post right now on social media, people commenting, I thought the two tours merged. There was also a lot of confusion that day. Was it the PGA Tour / DP World Tour merging with LIV or merging with the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia? If we can go back to that day, June 6th, because people have a lot of questions. One, did they merge? And two, what was still left open on that day that we're still seeing kind of the remnants of now 6 months later?
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, I was, funny enough, being presented to a group of about 40 sports law attorneys from around the world that morning, presenting on the LIV PGA Tour litigation, when my phone was exploding in my pocket, and I looked down and I was just glancing down and I kept seeing merger and like all sorts of stuff. And I was like, so I went up to all these 40 attorneys from around the world. And I was like, just so you know, a lot of this just may not matter anymore. So turn it into a case study, I guess. But so yeah, there was a little bit of a mess with the rollout, because I'm not sure Jay and Yasser used the word merger at the time, but I know the initial PGA Tour press release used the word merger, and I think the ticker on CNBC used the word merger. They purposely kind of walked back that language in response to antitrust concerns. But no, to answer your question specifically, they did not merge at that time. All that they did on June 6th, it was actually slightly before June 6th, but all that they did was enter into a non-binding framework agreement that said, number one, the only binding aspect of it is all the litigation is dismissed and it ends with prejudice, which means it cannot be refiled. And number two, that the parties would kick everything else down the road, and that by December 31st, they would try to come to terms on a definitive agreement. So what did they negotiate at the time? There was effectively nothing that was actually negotiated at the time. Really, all that they did was enter into an agreement that said, we're going to stop suing each other. We're going to stop spending tens of millions of dollars on legal fees. And we are going to try to come to terms on an agreement, and, bluebirds hang our laundry and everything is fun and happy after that. But obviously, as you see, that hasn't totally happened. So.
Obviously, we could get into it later on. The public files showing that in 2022, not 2023, which I'm sure people that glanced fast might have missed that. 2022, the PGA Tour went from spending just over $2 million in lawyer fees to over $20 million. So you talk about not wanting to spend as much on either side on your fellow attorneys. That obviously an aspect of that June 6th announcement. Also, I mean, I want to ask you this. Do we ever see that outside of sports, maybe from Fortune 500 companies or competitive companies? Have we ever seen, or has the Department of Justice, or has anyone seen something similar to that?
Similar in the context of the amount of legal fees?
In two companies reaching a framework agreement that, like you said, that framework agreement didn't assume all that much, except more or less start the conversation.
Yeah, I don't think that's totally uncommon. I think parties often enter into litigation and settlement agreements that kind of kick the can down the road. I think what you do see more often, though, is maybe parties give themselves a little bit more than 6 months to try to negotiate the terms that reshape an entire global sport. I think that is sort of setting themselves up for failure a little bit. And then with the reports coming out that even after that June 6th, I understand that there were some dragging of the feet to even start negotiations for a little while. So, I don't think it's totally uncommon. I think the DOJ has seen that before. There are litigation settlement agreements all the time, framework agreements like this. Every company, not every, but the vast majority of companies that buy and sell each other, they enter into it's letters of intent, it's called, or memorandums of understanding. And it's the same type of thing. They're generally non-binding with the exception of a handful of provisions. And then they kind of agree to everything later. It's just, as I mentioned, most of the time, it's not 6 months to agree to terms that, on this magnitude of a deal. So.
And we're still ongoing after 6 months.
I think we'll be ongoing.
One more thing, or maybe more. Well, we'll get to that, but I want to stick with the timeline here. So roughly a month, just over a month after that initial framework agreement was signed, we learned that one of the clauses that had been in there, which was the non-poaching clause, I'm sure it has more of a legal term to it, but that both sides would not, the PGA Tour and DP World Tour side, the Public Investment Fund side, the parent company of LIV Golf, they would not poach each other's players, each other's golfers. That was taken out in July, and the reasoning was because of anti-competitive, or the Department of Justice requesting that if we were ever going to get to a merger, that would need to be taken out to avoid anti-competitive behavior. What did that change in the framework agreement?
Well, it changed quite a bit in terms of it opened at least the PGA. I mean, we'll take a step back, I guess. It was a mutual non-poaching clause, but that clause really only effectively protected the PGA Tour at the time. The PGA Tour had obviously suspended LIV players, so they weren't out trying to go get them back onto the tour. So really what that did is it opened the door for the exact situation we have right now, which we may get into this a little more, but it opened the door for the Public Investment Fund to kind of throw a lot more money around, maybe in response to their dissatisfaction with the way that the negotiations have commenced so far. And what it did is it just greatly strengthened, at least in my opinion, some people may have different opinions, I think it greatly strengthened their negotiating position because they are now negotiating from a position of having somebody like John Rahm, having rumors of other guys, excuse me, other guys like Tony and Tyrrell Hatton, and I've seen Tommy Fleetwood thrown around a little bit. So there are, and these are pure speculative. So please, all the Twitter bots out there are going to come after me. But what it did is it opened up the PGA Tour to allow a situation like this, where I think the terms of the definitive agreement that they're going to come to now might not be as favorable to them because they don't have as much leverage as they had, even 10 days ago before John Rahm left. So If that non-poaching and non-solicitation clause was still in there, they may have had been coming from a much stronger negotiating position and been able to negotiate more favorable terms. But that's where we stand now.
Before people run for the hills, Tony Finau, right, put on Instagram, hashtag I'm not leaving, went full Leonardo DiCaprio, Wolf of Wall Street. So he says he's not going anywhere. Tyrrell Hatton has reportedly, I guess, signed up to play or has confirmed his appearance in the Century Tournament of Champions, or now it's just called the Century because he made the Tour Championship. So there's that going on. You mentioned Tommy Fleetwood. You mentioned there's some other names that have been thrown out. I think there's a lot of what we could call negotiating out in the open, a lot of rumors perhaps spread via leverage. But I think bringing up Tyrrell Hatton again, purely speculative. Tyrrell Hatton, we assume he's playing in January. Jon Rahm, you would think, could have, and if you're just tuning in and wondering what we're talking about, Jon Rahm, top 3 player in the world, has been a top 3 player for much of the last 3 to 4 years, the reigning Masters champion, 2-time major champion, multi-time, I believe 11-time PGA Tour champion, has left the PGA Tour for LIV Golf. He's the first player to leave for LIV Golf since the start of 2023, since the start of this LIV Golf season, months before that framework agreement that we talked about had been mentioned. You could argue Jon Rahm could have, why wouldn't he have waited until that first LIV event in February at Mayakoba to sign? But, John, there has to be an incentive, not just for the public investment fund that you mentioned, them wanting to get to a position of negotiation, but also for Jon Rahm to sign this deal before December 31st. Would you say probably, could have gained him potentially hundreds of millions of dollars as opposed to waiting?
Yeah, certainly. And that's kind of what Jordan Spieth alluded to too, is that Jon Rahm may have just seen a situation where neither side was really in a great place, and he figured, why not take the money now while it's there? To be frank, I'm surprised other players haven't thought the same thing. The interesting thing to me is that Rahm had offers on the table from LIV in the $400+ million range from the start of this. One of the initial offers reported back when Phil and DJ and everyone, that initial group left, was that Rahm had an offer on the table for about $400 million, and he turned it down. So I am just curious to know exactly what happened, from all of that time that offer was on the table to the last 6 months. And perhaps it was actually the rollout, the way that the framework agreement was negotiated. I know a lot of players took kind of big issue with that. Certainly someone like Jon Rahm probably feels like he should not have been kept in the dark. So maybe he felt that he didn't have to justify, his decision if he was to leave. But yeah, he certainly made quite a bit of money, and I'm sure that the Public Investment Fund, they're smart people. I think that they probably understand that they had to sweeten the pot a little bit for him to come, because at the end of the day, I don't think that signing Jon Rahm is a play just to get more fans, to get more eyeballs to LIV. They are struggling with their TV ratings, and they're struggling with ticket sales by all measures. And that's with guys like Phil, Cam, Brooks, Bryson, DJ, all these different guys. So I struggle to believe that signing Jon Rahm is going to just suddenly make a big difference. I think that they are willing to shell out all that money and do it before this, December 31st deadline, just to strengthen their negotiating position, which I think they've certainly done.
Obviously, this shakes everything up. And in terms of Jon Rahm's contract, I don't know if there are certain law we're seeing with Shohei Ohtani right now, which we don't want to turn this into an entire baseball podcast, but there will be potentially some legal discussions of what the Dodgers and him are doing, deferring $68 million per year. For those fans that might not know the figures, he just signed a reported deal of 10 years, $700 million, which you think would say, okay, that's 70 million in terms of average value per year. But we're being told that Shohei Ohtani will take $2 million every year and defer $68 million every year. So that comes to $680 million all the way to the end of the contract and get paid out after. Anyway, there's a lot of things going on there. Jon Rahm's contract. One thing that I have thought to myself, well, what is Jon Rahm's benefit if we do reach an agreement here between these two sides before December 31st? And obviously, Jon Rahm helps the negotiating the negotiating platform for the public investment fund. Could he have a deal that is front loaded or even signing bonus loaded to get all this done?
Yeah, he certainly can. So the terms of his deal haven't been disclosed, likely won't ever be disclosed. But he could. I mean, he's free to contract in any way that he wants. Unlike Shohei Ohtani, who the Dodgers have to deal with the players union, who is not going to like something like deferring $680 million of a contract for that long. There might be some pushback there. The pro golfers are not subject to any players union. So Rahm is kind of free to contract in any manner that he wishes. And I have to imagine that his agent, who is also Phil Mickelson's agent, probably negotiated something along those lines where it's significant upfront money. Obviously, they knew they had to roll out the red carpet a little bit for him to sign and make a little bit of a big splash here. So I would be very surprised if the terms of his contract weren't quite more favorable than the terms of maybe some of the guys that came initially or in the second wave.
Which is why maybe it's just the figures, we'll never see some of these contracts, or maybe it's going to be decades before we see some of these contracts. There is a difference of, there's a different conversation here than just figures and numbers. We don't know how many guys are getting paid at the end of their contracts. We don't know how many guys might be on a 3 or 4 year deal that's subject to, if LIV Golf does potentially close its doors. We're inferring that if there is a merger that comes and LIV Golf does close its doors, maybe some players get paid out, some don't. So all of this comes into play. On the PGA Tour side, there has been a lot of public negotiation that the tour has had with private equity partners. There was what I would call a wishy-washiness to, was this to bring in another partner to work with this framework merger with the public investment fund? There have also been a lot of rumblings that different public and, public equity partners were spoken to potentially be that dominant partner. And John, Sam, and I, my producer, were talking before we came on. I don't want to use the term majority partner at all, because I know LIV Golf's initial in the framework agreement, they would be the top, or whatever the legal term is, the top partner, but not necessarily a majority partner. We may not see a majority partner in this new for-profit potential entity. But roundabout way of asking, what do you make of the PGA Tour having these conversations over the last few months with other private equity partners? Yeah,
it was a very interesting development, and that started getting leaked. I don't know if it was leaked or, purposely or maybe unintentionally, but it was shortly after some pressure from Congress. And they said that they, could potentially bring in an outside partner in order to quell Congress's antitrust concerns. Basically meaning if there's some sort of domestic, U.S. money in this, and it's not solely public investment fund, sovereign wealth fund money, that it might quell some of the concerns of Congress and maybe avoid, a long drawn out, investigation. I do think that this entire Jon Rahm saga was sparked from maybe the PGA Tour policy board, or at least some members of the policy board. And I tweeted this out, maybe flirting a little bit too much with private equity and not trying to really negotiate in good faith as efficiently as possible with the public investment fund to come to an agreement. And I think the public investment fund's response to that flirting was to just throw another $1 billion around. And obviously we know for them it's a drop in the bucket, but what the big question there is, are they doing all of this just in an effort to enhance their negotiating position because they want to continue to come to terms on a definitive agreement, or have they abandoned the idea of coming to terms on a definitive agreement and they are just proceeding as, life with two separate tours. We don't know that answer yet. We'll see once this deadline, this soft December 31st deadline comes, whether it's extended or whether they actually come to terms. I would be shocked if anybody comes to terms by December 31st, but crazier things have happened. I thought it was pretty crazy to see Monahan and Yasir on my television screen. So if they come to terms on an agreement, I guess I can't be shocked.
I don't know if that was crazier than seeing John Rahm in a Letterman jacket on Fox News, but there's a lot of crazy things that we've seen in golf. And obviously that meeting that we have been hearing about between Jay Monahan and Yasir Al-Rumayyan, we still have not heard of it happening. It seems like it continues to be week to week as we come down the stretch here. You mentioned the private equity. I think back to the announcement, the TGL announcement at Fenway Park, with the Fenway Sports Group, obviously being right there with Rory McIlroy, CNBC, asking poignant questions about those conversations, not necessarily getting poignant answers for obvious legal reasons, which is kind of why we're talking about all this. One side question, but I think people need to understand it. What is a sovereign wealth fund?
Yeah, it's effectively a fund, a big pool of money that is controlled by a foreign government. So there is some of the more active ones, at least in the United States, is the Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund. There is the Qatari fund. Not sure exactly what they're called, but there's a Qatari fund. There's also, I think the biggest in the world, believe it or not, is the Norwegian fund, which has something like double the assets under management of the Public Investment Fund, if you can believe that. But yeah, so a sovereign wealth fund is effectively a arm of a foreign government that invests on behalf of that government. So that's what we're seeing with the Saudi Public Investment Fund. It is an arm of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that invests on behalf of the kingdom.
So I just looked it up because I wanted to make sure we got this right. It's the Qatar Investment Authority is basically the PIF equivalent of Qatar. And the reason that I think is important here is that they just bought 5% of the Washington Wizards from Monumental Sports Group, being the Sports and Entertainment Group, being the parent company there. The NBA about a year ago opened the door to public investment funds or sovereign wealth funds, like you said, being able to invest in teams. So this took place. The Qatar announcement with the Wizards was July 11th. I don't think it was accidental that the first public investment fund June 22nd. It was even closer to that June 6th date. I don't think it was a coincidence that this all happened right after the word merger was thrown around between the PGA Tour and the PIF. There's a lot here. I think it's going to become, John, right? This is going to become more regular in the United States. Obviously, the PIF much more active in European sports, in sports around the world before all of LIV Golf happened, whether that be Formula One, whether that be the Public Investment Fund buying Newcastle United in the Premier League. One of the 20 teams in the Premier League is owned by this entity. The Saudi International had become a part of the golf world in terms of being a DP World Tour event before going independent after all this happened. So there's a lot of conversation there between the way that everything is going to shake out. A little bit of a preface to where, if we get to an agreement, whether it be before December 31st or after, like I had said, in the framework agreement, the Saudis clearly wanted to make it a point that the Public Investment Fund would be the dominant investor in this new proposed for-profit parent company to the PGA Tour, DP World Tour, and Public Investment Fund or Golf Saudi endeavors. The PGA Tour, it seems like, and I don't think you can fault them for this, knows that they need another partner to get this all past the DOJ. Perhaps if this is ever going to get passed in the United States, they will need a partner that handles that invests more money than the Public Investment Fund, because the Department of Justice, to my knowledge, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is looking at this and seeing it as a potential precedent for all sorts of American companies beyond just golf. Is that where there's a little bit of a coming to a head that the public investment fund could say, well, we don't want to be a part of this if we're not the number one investor. Meanwhile, on the other side, you have the PGA, you have the Department of Justice saying, well, maybe there's a chance that we won't ever allow that to happen. So how do these two sides come to some sort of compromise?
Yeah, I think Congress's primary concern is just where the money is coming from, and that they are concerned with Saudi influence in a historic sport like golf in the United States. I think that also needs to be understood in terms of the structure. So when people say, the public investment fund is contributing all the money, so they're going to control everything, it's a little bit the structure of it. So what's going to happen, assuming, this is from the initial framework agreement, and what the initial was, who knows where the numbers are now. But I think the idea was that the public investment fund would commit $2 billion plus all of their LIV assets, which, at the time, objectively, they were not too valuable, to this new for-profit entity. And then the PGA Tour would contribute all of its commercial assets to that entity. That is all of their broadcasting contracts and revenues. That is all of their tournaments. That is all of their media rights. That is everything. So when people say, the public investment fund are contributing all the money, the PGA Tour, all of that stuff, the PGA Tour is contributing, all of those commercial assets have a really significant value. And I don't know what the valuation of that is, but if it's something like 10 billion, 12 billion, 15 billion, then you look at it from a perspective of, okay, the PGA Tour is contributing really 80% of the value to this for-profit entity. And then the public investment fund is contributing another 20%. So they may be contributing the actual liquid cash, but they're not contributing all the value to this for-profit entity. And I think where the DOJ was concerned, as I mentioned, is primarily just they don't like that it's going to be heavy Saudi influence in the United States. And they also, fair enough, don't like the idea of, the public investment fund has been making arguments in court for the better part of a year and a half that the PGA Tour is a monopoly and, they're anti-competitive. And now all of a sudden they're just merging into an even larger monopoly. So that is the hurdles that they're going to have to overcome. So I think if they do it in a manner that gets them some domestic investment and some U.S. investment alongside PIF, then that's possible. Like, problem with that is PIF may not be open to that. They may just say we don't want any other investors, and PGA Tour contributes all its assets and we contribute ours, and that's it. And if that's not the case, then we're continue to operate LIV as is. But yeah, there's still going to be hurdles with the Department of Justice and with Congress, no matter what type of agreement they come to, unless it's just a pure U.S. domestic investment, which I guess is not out of the realm of possibility either.
So, and I think that's a great way to explain it all. I think that's why I'm doing this podcast, John, to explain a little bit of all that. You mentioned, for example, the Norwegian public, or the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund. Do you think the Department of Justice would be treating this differently if perhaps it wasn't necessarily a mass oil entity like Saudi Arabia?
I do. I think so. I think that depending on what side of the aisle, and maybe not depending on what side of the aisle, some people just view Saudi Arabia as just a more hostile party to the United States than a country like Norway. Saudi Arabia has, we to an extent rely on them a significant amount for oil. So yeah, an entity like that we are relying on politically is coming in and controlling U.S. entities, or at least U.S. institutions, then I guess that you have some issues. And I think a lot of this also comes down to political grandstanding as well, to be frank, because the public investment fund has been making some pretty significant investments into a lot of U.S. companies and institutions for a long time. I think it's just very public that it's the PGA Tour, and it gives some of the politicians, a little campaign campaign boost. But nevertheless, the concerns are still there. And yes, I do think if it was a country like Norway, maybe there would be less pushback from Congress.
And it's interesting because, like we mentioned, with the NBA, American fans may see a lot more of these investments, and outside of sports, there's certainly going to become, more investments. And I also want to echo what one Rory McIlroy has said. I would say from the beginning that if certain people want to invest, whether it be the Saudis, whether it be the Qataris, if they want to invest in sports, there's a lot of people out there like Rory who would say, as long as this is done in, rather than becoming a hostile competitor, done in a way that enhances the history of sports and the entities that are already there, I think there's a lot of people that would be fine with that. I think we're not going to get in today to where the money's coming from and the concerns that people have there. And that is not us, I think, just saying sports washing is working and it's done. I think that that's a reality to the way that things are and the way that things are moving in this country. So not just in this country, but around the world. I think it's also important to touch on, John, what exactly this means when we talk about the PGA Tour creating a for-profit entity, this 501c6 that the PGA Tour has always operated as. That's not necessarily going away, but there is a parent company that is going to be a for-profit entity, and this does, in a way, mirror what we've seen from other professional sports in the U.S.
Yeah. So it is going, and I will preface all of this by saying I am certainly not a tax attorney, and it's probably going to take some type of interesting, tax strategy to structure it in a way that works. And I'm sure they'll figure it out. Tax attorneys are pretty brilliant in that respect, but there are some precedents to look to for that. For instance, the NFL Players Association, they are a non-for-profit, but they have an NFL Players Inc., which is a marketing and licensing arm of that nonprofit that is a for-profit entity. So I know that there's a possibility for it to work, and they will, the PGA Tour will probably look to frameworks and structures like that in order how to do it. I would be lying if I was to stand up here and tell you that I know how they're going to try to structure this from a tax perspective, because usually I see the word tax and I, forward that email immediately to our tax people.
Well, I think the important thing to note here, right, is the PGA Tour being a nonprofit in the past, in the most basic terms, needed to donate as much money or give back as much money as the tour was making in revenue. And, there are a lot of people with rightful concerns that so many of these PGA Tour events have meant a lot to various communities and have taken that as, there are charities that rely on the PGA Tour to be their biggest partners. I mean, you look at some of the names like Shriners Children's Hospital, and I think about Sanderson Farms and everything that it gives back to Mississippi. That was the first event I covered on PGA Tour Live. There are so many of these. And the PGA Tour, it seems like, will obviously, like you said, see where things happen, but the NFLPA might be a great example of it. Doesn't mean that the charitable donations are necessarily going away. It might just mean that some aspects of professional golf are turned into this for-profit side, which I believe the MLB is the perfect example of an organization that was a 501c6 and turned itself into a for-profit entity. I believe the NFL, I don't want to be quoted on this, but I believe that the NFL did that too. So it's happened in the PGA Tour because of a lot of the things that we mentioned, and being an individual sport not run by teams and owners, it's been able to continue operating as a 501c6. But that is all, it seems like, going to be shaken up. Jon Rahm signing, did that shake up the initial framework agreement to the point that it kind of has to be thrown out the door? We talked about the non-poaching clause that had been taken out in July, but how does that change up anything that was in the initial framework?
So I don't think it changes up anything that was in the initial framework agreement. And the only reason I say that is because there was almost nothing in that initial framework agreement. It was like 3.5 pages long. And basically all it said is the parties will terminate all of their litigation with prejudice, and then we'll figure it out later. That's effectively what the framework agreement said. So all that Jon Rahm signing did is just change the negotiating position of the two parties, at least in my opinion. I think that it significantly changed, increased the public investment fund's negotiating stance, maybe embolden them a little bit. Maybe they can demand certain things in the final agreement that maybe they wouldn't have had if somebody like Jon Rahm hadn't left earlier. But in terms of the actual framework agreement itself, it was really bare bones to begin with. So there's nothing in there that it really changed, because there was nothing there to change.
What happens if the two sides don't reach an agreement by December 31st?
Yeah, that December 31st deadline, which people, even Jay Monahan keeps calling it a deadline.
What does it mean?
Yeah, it's a soft deadline. So essentially what it says is the parties will work toward a definitive agreement by December 31st, unless mutually extended by the parties, which means it's going to be mutually extended by the parties. Unless negotiations have fallen so drastically and they're in such bad shape that they're just going to call it off entirely. So what I would expect is, at an absolute minimum, 3-month, 6-month extension, if not longer. I would expect next year, at an absolute bare minimum, for the PGA Tour and LIV to operate as they've been operating for the last 2 years. Is your Masters poster okay there?
I was going to say, if everyone, we're going to put this, we're putting up all video, John, and this, we'll decide on YouTube if it's side by side or full picture in picture, because I don't know if it's poetic or what it is, but my 2017 Masters flag just flopped on down as the double-sided tape wasn't exactly working to as much as I needed it to. I want to ask another question going into December 31st. Jon Rahm, that was announced on a Thursday. Sunday night, the PGA Tour announces that Strategic Sports Group, led by Fenway Sports Group, is the group that the PGA Tour hasn't necessarily chosen, hasn't written. It doesn't seem like there's even paperwork necessarily signed between the two, but that is the group that the PGA Tour wants to bring in as the lead private equity partner to help negotiate everything, to help be that third, I don't know if you want to call it a third or a fourth partner. Obviously, the DP World Tour also needs to be mentioned as a partner in all of this, but Strategic Sports Group, with some of the big names, the John Henrys of the world at Fenway Sports Group, Tom Ricketts, Cubs owner, Mark Lasry was with the Bucks, Steve Cohen, obviously we got in New York, jumps into this, Arthur Blank. These are big names, and some people reacted to that announcement and said, this is the PGA Tour taking a step in the right direction to get this done. Other people looked at it and said, did this mean anything? What was your takeaway from that announcement?
It was an odd announcement, because it was like, here's the Strategic Sports Group, and they are going to be managing and handling all of this. And then, oh, by the way, we're still negotiating toward an agreement with the Public Investment Fund. So the announcement, it said a lot, in my opinion, seemed like it said a lot of nothing. It was just, kind of here's an update, and the update is we're going to update you later. That's kind of what it looked like to me. I wouldn't be totally surprised. So the Strategic Sports Group, whether they're coming on as an investor or whether, just to quell the concerns of Congress, those people, not only are they very powerful in terms of they have a lot of sports connections and they have a lot of money and they can invest in the PGA Tour, they also have a ton of relationships, and they have relationships with Congress people, and they have relationships in lobbyists and in, those type of interests, that if they are a part of this deal, it's certainly a possibility that some Congress people that may have had a concern with it initially might, maybe pull back the reins a little bit. So it is for no pun intended, maybe a strategic partnership with Strategic Sports Group. But yes, it'll be interesting to see where that goes. I don't know if they're coming in because they are going to be a minority investor alongside PIF. I don't know if they're handling negotiations, in exchange for a fee. I'm not sure where that goes. So the all of the PGA Tour's announcements and all of the announcements surrounding this entire thing so far have been really lacking details. So it's kind of a wait and see for all of us at this point.
I want to reword a question I sort of already asked, but now that we've touched on them as well, what does the DOJ need to see? I don't want to say want to see. What do they need to see in your mind to get something done here?
Yeah, and it's a perfect question because the really the hallmark and the cornerstone of antitrust is whether something is best for the consumer or not. There are plenty of monopolies in this country. It is not necessarily it's not necessarily illegal to have a monopoly. It's illegal to maintain a monopoly. So the interesting thing is, I think the DOJ is probably going to do some investigation. They're going to want to see, number one, that there is not a ton of public investment fund influence on this. So something like having a 3-member board, 2 of which are indefinitely appointed by the PGA Tour, so that maybe the public investment fund can't ever retain control, with the exception of maybe some veto rights over certain actions. And then the second thing is they need to know that it's best for the consumer, which I don't think, in my opinion, is a really tough hurdle, because if these two parties do come together and they actually do come to terms on a definitive agreement, and all of these players are back and playing against each other all the time, I think that is pretty indisputably best for all of the consumers. I mean, people want to see all of these guys playing against each other on a consistent basis. And that's really what I hope happens, because I tweeted this a few weeks ago. I see a lot of similarities right now between the PGA Tour or not the PGA Tour, but I see a lot of similarities between the golf world and what boxing was in the 80s, 90s, where it was one of the most popular sports in the world, and then all of a sudden fragmented into all sorts of different governing bodies, different weight classes, different, 3 different heavyweight champions of the world. And that is my concern with golf. We may all be into it because we're such big golf fans, but golf is still a very niche sport, and it is very vulnerable right now to something like that, where it splinters off into, a DP World Tour, a PGA Tour, a LIV Tour, an Asian Tour, and all players are playing all over the place, and there's no one central one central governing body that governs it. So I really hope that they come to terms on a definitive agreement, and I hope they figure it out, because I think that is best for the consumer, and I think that's pretty undisputed.
I brought this up in the intro, but I want to give him credit. My guy Alex Myers at Golf Digest said on, I guess, during Monday Night Football, this is a great reminder for golfers who suddenly think they deserve to be paid like NFL players for some reason. Tommy DeVito is probably more known in the U.S. than John Rahm already. Yeah. So you talk about sort of tempering expectations to how much everyone is worth and how much golfers are worth, because I think you're right. There's the ultimate fear that I have as someone who loves the sport, who wants the best for the sport, who enjoys watching the best play the sport, is that things will get too segmented and fractured, and that this person will claim to be this champion and this person will claim to be this champion, and we'll have many professional tours that are going 2 to 3 months at a time, or only select events, as everyone just tries to grab as much money as possible here. The boxing analogy is interesting because people, John, look at the sport of boxing. I'll say this because the players think about this differently than the fans. There are people out there are boxing fans who might say, well, Floyd Mayweather, Canelo, Triple G, these guys make so much more than Muhammad Ali made. But of course, that's at the expense of the vast majority of boxers. How do we, and this gets into sort of our last topic of the night, how do we get perhaps the best professional golfers to understand that if they push too far, or different agents and different partners involved, if they push too far, that their clients might make the most amount of money, they are dividing the rich and poor to almost a detrimental level of this game?
Yeah, it's a great point, because the consolidation that something like LIV is effectively doing, it creates the top 50 players in the world, and that's at the expense of the rank and file. So this is part of what I think needs to be included in the framework agreement. Is there needs to be some method, and there's clearly enough money to do it. There needs to be some method of maintaining the rank and file. There needs to be a method of maintaining things like Q School. There needs to be a method of maintaining things like charitable donations. If there's enough money to do all of that, then we need to do all of that. I think that would go a very long way to maybe win over a decent amount of fans if they said, we are not going to come in and turn this into a tour that is the top 75 players in the world, and those are the only people that are professional golfers, or at least tour members. So yeah, I think that's what needs to happen, and there does need to be an understanding that if they push too hard, that there is a risk that the tour becomes 50 to 75 guys, and that's it. And then it's unfortunate, but I think the terms of any definitive agreement really need to take into consideration, the people that are the guys that are in the 50 to 200 to 300 range, because the vast majority of the guys that are now in the top 50 at one point were in that 50 to 200. And it would be a shame if, there was no way to develop and, find those next stars.
And I'm not here to litigate, how to properly compensate everyone and how to spread FedEx Cup points and dollar amounts through the PGA Tour, through the rank and file members, down to the Korn Ferry Tour, down to PGA Tour Americas. Lucky for me, I just get to show up and talk about it. And whatever they hand me in terms of those FedEx Cup guidelines at the start of the year, that is what I will recite on every broadcast. But we do need to touch on it because, Jay Monahan and all those at the top, and you mentioned the policy board, they're dealing with everything with the Public Investment Fund, working with Strategic Sports Group. They get a letter this past week from 21 players with a law firm attached, basically saying these guys want transparency. They want to know more. They want more of a say in what's happening with them. I can imagine at the PGA Tour office, it's like they don't want to deal with a legal battle right now on two fronts. But is there anything that these guys, do they have any power, these players, because the PGA Tour is a member organization? Is there anything that these guys can do to block what's going on at the top, or anything other than just voting in certain individuals to the policy board?
Yeah, so the policy board is going to be, it's pretty clear cut. The policy board is going to be the one that votes on any agreement. So I don't think that the 21 or 20 golfers that wrote that letter are going to be able to, form as a group and try to block any agreement, especially considering that the exception of maybe one or two, they voted on these policy board. It's the same as voting an elected representative to act on your behalf. And that's kind of what happened. They voted certain player directors in to act on their behalf, and those player directors are now doing so. I don't know that they have too much of a legal ground to try to demand transparency, but it is interesting that there's 20 of them, and it is interesting that they hired the kind of a powerhouse antitrust firm to do so. Potentially they try to do some sort of, I don't anticipate a lawsuit. I think that they are probably smart enough to know that they, press a little too hard, it could backfire. But I think that it is certainly something to watch. But I think the PGA Tour policy board at the end of the day is going to make the decision as the elected representatives of those golfers. So the fact that they are just not, seeing any agreements yet and demanding transparency and demanding all this, it unfortunately doesn't always work that way. And they have to rely and they have to trust that their elected officials are going to negotiate an agreement that's best for them.
Sussman Gottfried is I believe the law firm that you mentioned in New York City. that these players are dealing with. Obviously, we're talking about a group of players that golf fans know. Maybe the average fan doesn't necessarily know all these names. Danny Willett, perhaps being the most prominent as a former Masters champion. You're always a Masters champion. You win the Masters. He's a Masters champion. Wesley Bryan, among those other names on there, Ches Reavie. You kind of mentioned it. The PGA Tour is a representative government. We've heard so many different takes in terms of, Jay Monahan is out there negotiating and speaking behind the players' backs. But then at the same time, you go back to the Delaware meeting, you go back to some of the things that the initial reaction to LIV Golf by the players, sort of creating these signature events. The players also have power. I know your job as a lawyer is not to determine, like I said, the precedents and the roles of everyone within the PGA Tour. But why is this that you have a membership organization, but you also have some individuals out there representing the PGA Tour versus sometimes you have the PGA Tour players themselves? Tiger Woods is not out there sitting with Yasser Al-Rumayyan. It's Jay Monahan, but Tiger Woods back at the policy board is determining a lot of what's going on.
Yeah, well, a lot of that has changed in response to, I think, the rollout. I think the players, justifiably so, maybe kind of revolted at some point in June, and they added a sixth player director, which gave them an advantage or a majority on the policy board, which they didn't have previously. So I think that the players, maybe they hadn't genuinely, maybe it wasn't truly a member run tour prior to June 6th. And if it wasn't, I think it's certainly a lot closer to that now with the addition of the extra player director on the policy board. And oh, by the way, that player director is Tiger Woods. So I think that the players certainly are wielding significantly more power now than they were before. I saw there was a report that Jimmy Dunn and Ed Hurley, who were the ones that negotiated the initial framework agreement, or at least we're meeting with the Public Investment Fund, have not been even anywhere near the negotiations since June, and it's been kind of player run. So if that's the case, and that's just kind of a report that I heard, if that's the case, then yeah, it is certainly much getting to be more of a member run tour now than it was before.
I just want to show that my double-sided tape continues to fail me, but this is a Players' Championship flag that came down as you were talking about Ed Hurley and Jimmy Dunn. We've reached this point, John. You've given so much, and I'm so glad that you were able to explain, I think, so many things, put this in terms for people to understand what is going on from a legal perspective. And the only thing I have left for you is, well, where do we go from here? Where do you see things going as we approach this December 31st deadline? And as the golf world and golf fans just say, we just want to see the best players playing together in the best events at the best courses. What happens now?
Yeah, I hope that's where it goes. I hope that these two parties, I'm confident that they are going to extend this December 31st deadline. I don't think we're going to see anything by then. I think after that, especially with the recent developments, I think there's probably a little bit more of a fire under all of the parties to negotiate a definitive agreement at this point that works for everybody. Because no matter the momentum that LIV has, or at the moment with these signings, they still are going to benefit greatly by partnering with the PGA Tour. PGA Tour has the infrastructure, they have the reputation, they have the broadcasting deals. They would probably open LIV at least partially up to official world golf ranking points. I know it's not controlled by the PGA Tour, but I'm certain it would probably help. On the flip side, the PGA Tour, they could use an injection of $2 billion in order to fund their purses, in order to fund maybe their charitable purposes and things like that. So it is beneficial to both parties to come to a definitive agreement. And it's also beneficial to all of the fans that they would do so that we can see all of these players playing against each other week in and week out. And my hope is that we get there sometime in the middle of next year, and by 2025, maybe we see a unified tour, and it'll be a lot more fun to see at that point.
For you, it's a lot about hope versus your heart versus your your brain in terms of
Yes.
being a lawyer and also being a golf fan, but it certainly sounds like there is a chance, and there's a chance things do happen. There's a chance things don't happen, but it certainly looks like we're going to see Jon Rahm in, I'll say it, a LIV Golf uniform, because he'll be wearing some sort of player outfit if it does come to that when LIV Golf does start its 2024 season in February. It's going to be another weird year in golf, and that'll definitely create an interesting situation if we get to the Masters and Jon Rahm is the defending champion and we are still at this point. John, it's I thought we'd go half an hour. We've gone just about an hour. So thank you so much for doing this. Follow him, J Nucci, Nucci 23, for all of your golf law content on Twitter and beyond. And also, if you're in the Rochester area, John, or anywhere, and you need a good lawyer, this is your guy.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Awesome stuff there from John. I know I learned a lot. I hope you learned a lot. And hopefully this isn't all old news too fast. Or maybe hopefully it is, as we approach this December 31st deadline. If you like what you heard, maybe it was your first time listening to Eyes on Golf, remember to like and subscribe Eyes on Golf, as we are getting things rolling. We're getting things off the ground. We've got a few more things to go before we break for the holidays, maybe to give you some listening material to wherever you go for the holidays and for New Year's. I'm Jeff Eisenman. Big shout out to our producer, Sam Brief, for making this all work, and appreciate again John Nucci stopping by. We'll see you next time on Eyes on Golf.